Welcome to the Via Stoica Podcast, your path to tranquility. This is the podcast on Stoicism, brought to you by viastoica.com, where we discuss this ancient philosophy of living the good life. Hosted by Bryce, Brendan, and Benny, we are here to help you apply Stoic wisdom to your everyday life. No matter what obstacles you're facing, whether it's work stress, relationship issues, or just the general ups and downs of life, Stoicism has something to offer us all.
Oh, I'm great, Benny. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Well, it's evening here, more or less, so we are separate in the location, but we are not separate in minds. The Stoic minds are always going, and I just finished some books here, and I figured let's talk about some Stoic books today. What do you think about that?
Oh, it's a great topic. Love it. Let's do it.
Do you also get a lot of people asking you questions like, hey, what do I want to read? Where do I start with? And I get those questions, when I go to other podcasts and when I speak to people. How about you? Do you get those questions? And I think that's something that would be a great way to start, to see where we can start people off if they want to go into this Stoic journey and want to pick up some books. But do you get that a lot? And what is your usual answer when someone asks, like, hey, where do I start when I want to read some Stoic books?
Yeah, no, I get that a lot. I think it is, it's a topic, as people have started to become more aware of Stoicism. I feel like it's kind of the next iteration. At first you kind of are comfortable with listening to it or maybe, listening to some wonderful podcast on it, like this one. But then, you want to start to dig into it yourself. You want to get into the meat and potatoes yourself. And I think that's when, it's when people make that transition. They say, okay, I really want to dig into this now. Where are the books? Where are the written word that I need to kind of consume? And I think for me, I like to, at least, I guess I'll share my story of how I discovered Stoicism and the journey that I went on, and then, add in some flavor for how I might want to change that. But I started, I first heard it on a podcast. It was Tim Ferriss's podcast. I heard Ryan Holiday speaking on there, promoting one of his books. And that's how I became aware of Stoicism and started listening to the Daily Stoic Podcast, which is Ryan Holiday's podcast. And then eventually, after some time, then picked up his book. So started with his book, The Obstacle is the Way, was the first book I read. And then, which does talk about that concept that, kind of as Stoics, we welcome the challenge, we go, we work through the challenge. So that was very poignant for me at the time when I was starting to read books. Like, that concept was something that I wanted to dig into more. So I think that's one thing to mention is that there's no right way necessarily to do this. It's not a requirement that you read one book before another. Do what feels best to you, because at the end of the day, that's where you're going to get the most value. So I started with The Obstacle is the Way. And then, Ryan Holiday does have some other books. The Ego is the Enemy and Stillness is the Key. I ended up picking up those as well and reading those. But again, they were in moments in my life when I said, you know what, I really need some stillness right now. Let me dig into Stillness is the Key. So that's where I went, and I actually didn't dive into the ancient text for a while. It was probably a year or two into my study of Stoicism where I was basically just consuming Ryan Holiday's content. And then once I got to I lived in Athens for 6 months during lockdown, during COVID. So when I was in Athens, I said, well, I got to get some Stoic books while I'm here. So I picked up Meditations, and that's the first time that I sat down and read Meditations kind of all the way through. So, which kind of added like an extra layer to my understanding of Stoicism, like not only to read the ancient text, so the text written, 2,000 years ago, but to also read it from, with Meditations and Marcus Aurelius. It is his private journal. So it's him talking to himself, which I do a lot of. I talk to myself all the time. I'm in my own head having conversations with myself about whatever. So like that sort of, I guess that delivery method was really nice for me too. So I really enjoyed Meditations, from like just reading it and enjoying it as like you're kind of peering behind the curtain of this world leader. So that was where I started to get into the ancient text, and then started to even pick up other books, but we'll get into that, some of the other more modern day Stoic authors here in a minute. But what about you, Benny? Where did you start? Like how did your journey come around as far as like reading Stoic books?
So I was originally never really a big reader. I never really read a lot of books. That's just who I was. But then after when my relationship and things went downhill a little bit, I spend more time with myself and just, going through things. And one of my colleagues and close friends, he was an avid reader, right? Very much into literature. So he started giving me books and I started reading science fiction and novels and all that stuff. And we talked about philosophy. And I always say I diagnosed myself with an existential crisis. So I was like, I'm going through something here. So, and he said there's a really good book by Orson. I can't remember exactly his name, James Orson. It's called Introduction into Existentialism. And the great part of that book is that it kind of compared different philosophies, existentialism, absurdism. I think there was Epicureanism in there as well, but also the Stoics. So that's where I really had my first introduction, really more aware, right? Where you're consciously aware, I'm seeking for something, and that's where those words really jumped at me. And so after that, I felt compelled to read more. So I started looking for books, and obviously, I came to Marcus Aurelius because when you Google Stoic books, you see Marcus Aurelius, and I figured that's where I want to start. I had no idea what it was. So the first time I opened a book, it's wait, these are very short little things, right? I was expecting this deep philosophical book, and as I was reading it, I was I wasn't really making a lot of sense of it because it is kind of his personal thoughts, which I loved, right? I loved Rome, and I've visited Rome a few times, and so I love that time period and that kind of world. So for me, that had multiple layers to me, as the historic view, but also the personal view and the Stoic view. So that's kind of where I started, my journey. And then I went to I think it was Epictetus. I pretty much tackled the ancients first. So I took a little bit of a different approach to you, more of maybe also a little bit of vanity. It's I got to go there, right? It's got to, even if I don't really understand exactly what's going on, let's just read them first, right? So I did that. I made my notes and I figured, now I understand everything. And then I went to the more contemporary writers. So I took I to be honest, I didn't read Ryan Holiday until maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Just really recently, I figured, okay, if I want to be able to talk about him, then I should read one of his books at least, right? The Obstacle of the Way. You know me, Brendan, I'm not a very big fan of his writing, and we can talk about that in maybe another episode or whatever. But I do respect what he does, but it's just not for me. So I picked up, I think it was Massimo Pigliucci's book, How to Be a Stoic, which was really great. I think I even read that before Seneca, if I'm not mistaken. Why? Because it's that book, and you read it just recently, I think, or just at least we read it or whatever recently, and I like that it's a conversation that he has with Epictetus, right? So he talks about these things. And he uses excerpts from Epictetus' text to kind of what would he say? And Epictetus is kind of pointing his finger at it. I was you should be doing this. And that's why for me, for example, one of the ancient Stoics that I like, and I like to hear your point of view as well. My favorite one is Epictetus, because he's saying hey, Benny, you should be, a little bit more like this stern teacher, and that's what I need, right? Where Marcus Aurelius is more a bit more romantic in his way of looking at it and philosophical, and Epictetus is really telling you, be more mindful of what you do. So for me, it was kind of that journey that I took. I figured okay, where do I go? And some of the books I just went into the library, and it's hey, that's a nice Stoic book. So I think I read Seneca's Dialogues and Essays first, and then I read Musoni's Rufus. Michel de Montaigne, we can talk about that later. He's not really the ancient Stoics, but those were the books that I read. And one of the other ones, and we can talk about that as well, is the Guide to the Good Life by William Irvine. Those were that was my start. Would I start the same way? I think that's something that we can talk about as well, but at least that's how I started. But maybe if someone wants to start, maybe now I would give some different sequence of how to read these books.
Well, I mean, don't leave us hanging, Benny. What is if you were to go back in time and kind of give yourself sort of like a 3 to 5 book reading list, what do you think that would be?
Maybe, and it wouldn't be too drastically different, but maybe it would be the sequence would be different. For example, I read How to Think Like a Roman Emperor quite late, but later on in the journey, the book by Donald Robertson. And I think it is interesting to see some of these writers, they connected to the ancients. So how I would read it now, and either, I would probably start with Marcus Aurelius again, but then read How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, because that really connects with Marcus Aurelius. You learn more about his history, more about the philosophy, more about why he thinks certain ways. So having kind of like an ancient and a contemporary mix would be nice. For example, Epictetus and then Massimo Pigliucci's book, How to Be Stoic. Then you have Seneca with either Breakfast with Seneca or Dying Another Day, Seneca at the Court of Nero, kind of having that kind of mix. I think that would be a little bit nicer. But I think at the end of the day, and I reread a lot of those books afterwards again, just kind of like, oh, wait, now I get it more, right? I don't know, like, what would you kind of, if you were to advise someone how to read these books, what would you say? Like, you shared your journey, but what would be the perfect sequence for you if you had to do it again?
Yeah, so for me, I did, and like you said, like it sounds like in the beginning for you, you kind of started to dive into the ancient texts more. I was a bit averse to doing that in the beginning. I think I had picked up one. I don't even remember which one. And when I say picked up, I mean, I think I got a sample on Kindle or something, right? And I started reading it and I was just like, this isn't for me. Like just the language, the way it was written, like it just didn't resonate the same way that, I was, because I was already getting Stoicism from the Daily Stoic Podcast. So I was like, that stuff resonates with me. That stuff makes sense to me. But like what I was reading, and maybe I think it was Seneca's letters, but I'm not certain. But what I was reading, I was just like, this is just like the connections weren't happening as easily for me. And so I really stuck with Ryan Holiday's stuff for a while. So I guess on one hand, I do like that though. Like I think he does, while I agree with you and like some of your perspectives where you're like, oh, he's writing for more of an American audience. I do think that's true now that you've brought my attention to that. And I can understand how that would be, a bit strange for a European or someone from another country picking it up. But I just, because of like the way he writes, where he talks about a concept and then he relates it to the historical reference, like I just like the historical stories and the references. So I still like Obstacle is the Way as kind of a first jumping off point, as the starting point. But then I wish I went into the ancient text and the other modern day writers sooner. Because yeah, like you mentioned, I just started reading the more modern day Stoics. I kind of went from Ryan Holiday to the ancients, and now I'm getting back into like other modern day writers outside of Ryan Holiday. So The Guide to the Good Life was by far, by William Irvine, was for me one of the most, the books that really gave me like, I think the best overview, the best understanding of like not only ways to incorporate these sort of teachings into our life, but what the outcome is afterwards. Like once you do this is kind of, so I think it's a good one to start with, because it gives you kind of almost like the roadmap of what you're going to see in front of you as you keep moving forward. So I really like that one being earlier, Meditations being earlier. I think to me, Meditations is the book, and maybe that's just my own bias, because like I do find Marcus Aurelius is definitely of the three Stoics, the one that I find I more resonate with. Epictetus is one that I go to when I know I need that sort of speaking. I need someone to talk to me that way. Like I've definitely been like, I feel like I'm in a place right now where I need to read more Epictetus. Like I need that sort of, he's more raw about the like what you're supposed to be doing thing. And then maybe I need that kind of, kick in the ass a little bit. So I like Epictetus sometimes. Like I know when I need to go to him, but Marcus is where I hang out the most. So, and then, yeah, I think Discourses is another one that I think is a really good one to start with, or at least get under your belt early, to read early. And then How to Be Stoic by Massimo Pigliucci is, I think, another really good one. So those would kind of be my 5 as far as like, so you're getting some ancients, you're getting some modern day in there as well. But I think that's a good place to start. And then just of that, then where do you want to go next? And I think that's the beauty of it, is you're not going to run out of text. That's the fun part about this, is you always have more. There's always something else to read. So, what makes sense to you? And are you, also be aware and conscious of, because like I was aware, because I wasn't a reader at all before I started picking up Stoicism, but it was the way that Ryan Holiday connected the themes with historical references that allowed me to be like, oh, I want to read this book. Because worst case scenario, even if I got nothing from the Stoicism side of things, I was still just learning about history, which made me happy. So if you're like that, then, read like that. And, or like, for example, like the conversation, like in How to Be Stoic, where he's having a conversation with Epictetus in the book, like that's an interesting style of writing versus more of like, how to think like a Roman emperor is a little different. Like it just, the style of writing is different. The method in which they're presenting the information is different. So I think that's always something I like to think about too, is what do I feel? How am I feeling right now? And what sort of book do I want to dive into?
And would you say that The Guide to the Good Life by William Irvine, would you say that made the biggest impact to you in Stoicism, or would you still attribute that to, like, who would you say from the books and the text, who would have made the biggest influence on you? Would you say that would be Ryan Holiday, because he was the kind of the first with the podcast and he spoke to you in that moment? Or when you look at the journey now, like who you say like this was really that sparked it all?
That's a great question, Benny. I would say that, at the end of the day, Ryan Holiday has put out more books, and between the books and the podcast and I read the Daily Stoic every day. So, I'm just consuming his content literally every day. So he's, as far as amount, Ryan Holiday, no question. But I will say, like, after reading The Guide to the Good Life, for me, I don't know what, I think it was that kind of spark that took me to the next level of, like, before I was a student and now I'm attempting to like put a framework around this and educate others about this, of what this philosophy means. And I think that's what A Guide to the Good Life did for me, because it kind of is the whole picture of like, hey, you're struggling with this, you're dealing with these challenges. Well, if you can apply these methods and these concepts, and when you do, you get this life. And like, so it gives you that kind of full sort of 3-step process, which is what someone who's trying to bring these concepts to people and educate people, it would want to do, right? You'd want to kind of show people like, why do you want to learn this stuff? Well, this is why. So I think that's what The Guide to the Good Life did for me, is kind of put that framework around it. And I think it's really just the next iteration of my journey in Stoicism. Like, it started with just a soul journey, which was just by myself. I spoke with no one about it. Like, there were good friends of mine and family members that had no clue that I even knew that I was studying Stoicism every single day, because it was a very private thing I did. And then it became a bit more public, right? I started to speak on it with like some other people, but not too many. And now we speak about it every week on the internet. So, I think that these books are, they hit in the right time, and they fill that kind of void that you might be searching for. And in this moment, when I read Guide to the Good Life, it was well suited for me.
Yeah, that's great. And I think what a book like Guide to the Good Life does, it connects the teachings, right? Because that's the difficult thing when you read someone like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. It is sometimes quite difficult to get the actual practical application out of it, because you read it and it's like, oh, this quote is lovely, but how do I apply it, right? How do I use this in my life? And that's what I like, for example, about How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, where Donald Robertson uses his therapeutic, the experience that he has as a CBT practitioner, and he shows the link between CBT and Stoicism, which I find fascinating, right? That modern day therapy is so influenced by an ancient philosophy, but he also brings it down into these practical things. So it's kind of like a philosophical self-help book. And that's what I feel like the William Irvine does as well. Like he shows like, okay, this is the dichotomy of control, or he calls it the trichotomy of control, which would be another good conversation to have about that thing, right? But he also says like, this is how you apply it, right? This is how it works. Or for example, the when he talks about being an athlete, right? You can prepare all the things that you want, but in the match, then it's where you have to surrender to fate, right? You're doing all the preparation, and whether you win or lose, that should be irrelevant. So those kind of examples is what I really like, because that's kind of the eye openers that you don't really get from the ancient text per se. And like you mentioned, or you think you started with Seneca, right? And I have the same. Sometimes when I read Seneca, it's like, what's going on here, dude? It's like, where are you going with this? Because he just like kind of like feels like he gets stuck on the paper just writing more. So that's why I like to read those kind of, sometimes it's like, Marcus Aurelius for dummies. Sometimes that's what I feel like I need, right? It's like, can someone explain this to me? And that's why I like to combine them with those books. So for me, like as you have with Marcus Aurelius, I have that with Epictetus, right? As I mentioned, like he was the kind of voice that I needed to hear. And I think like if people want to start with Epictetus, you have the discourses and the handbook and some fragments. Maybe the handbook, the Enchiridion, would be a nice way to start with Epictetus, then read Massimo Pigliucci, and then maybe go into the discourses. I think that would be a good way to kind of start, to ease yourself in. Let's read some raw Epictetus, and then just go to it. Let's get an explainer and then take the discourses, because there's so many of them anyway. So it takes, and we're doing summaries on Via Stoica. So if you want, I think the first book is almost there, every discourse. So if you want to read a little bit of a summary, you can go to viastoica.com and check them out. But I think that for me, that's the mix. And yeah, like once I read, Donald Robertson, and we had him here on the show, and we had him on some of the spaces. It's also nice to see that these people who write these books are so accessible, and that they are still here, and you can read it in the books. Like I've emailed with Massimo Pigliucci, and Bryce had him on another interview that he did. So it's so nice that they actually apply this stuff as well, and that's what you read, right? They write it because they feel like the value is there. I think and I guess that's also what you see with Ryan Holiday, right? When you watch his videos and when you watch his content, you see that this is part of his life, and he conveys it. So, and one other thing that I think you mentioned is really important, that again, when we talk about any of these things, you need to find your own way of doing it. And the same thing with reading, right? So we can give these books, and just look at them, and if they speak to you, and if this is the part of your life where you need to hear this kind of message or that kind of message, I think that's also, there is not really a right or wrong, right, to start with any of these books. They could just and if you stumble on one of them and you say, hey, this book, I don't even know what this means, but let's read it, and hey, these are the Stoics. So, but I think if I had to start again, that would be kind of the mix that I would have. But at the end of the day, I'm super happy that I actually started reading books. They changed my life a lot.
Oh, that's great. I think I like that you brought up How to Think Like a Roman Emperor again, because that was a good one too when I read that, because of that connection between psychology and philosophy. I have a minor in psychology from college, so I'm very interested in that. So it was cool, because that was something I didn't know about Stoicism until I was probably 4 or 5 years down the road, that it even had some sort of anchoring in therapy. And I love also talking, like I have my own therapist that I meet with regularly. And then, it was so interesting being able to talk to him. Like he didn't know what Stoicism was, but when I bring up, what is it? Robert Ellis? Is it Robert Ellis?
Yeah.
Ellis is the last name. I think it's Robert, but either way, Ellis, the guy who founded CBT, he connects it back to Stoicism, man. And it's just fun to like kind of talk with therapists about that, because a lot of times it's not always well known that these tactics and these sort of things that are used in therapy are actually 2,000 years old. So I think, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor is really good. And I like what you mentioned too, that idea of kind of like pairing books together, because that was what I did is once I guess felt like I was able to dig into the ancients, well then I just started reading a lot of the ancient texts. But I do maybe wish like that would be an interesting journey to kind of have that back and forth, to read the ancient text, come back to a modern text, read the ancient, like that sounds almost a little bit more interesting. And maybe a little bit easier to digest too, because, you know, sometimes those letters can get long, and those letters can you know, they're taxing to read sometimes. So no, great points there. Are there any sort of books that we want to add into this list that maybe aren't necessarily strictly Stoic, you wouldn't find in the philosophy section of the bookstore? You know, and I can start if you want to take a minute to think about it, but because I do feel like, and that's the beauty of Stoicism, like it is a philosophy of the people, it is a philosophy of the streets. So I do feel like that there is just stories out there that represent Stoic ideals and Stoic teachings. So two for me that stand out are, you know, Endurance, which is a book about these group in the early 1900s. Shackleton was this captain, this boat captain, and he wanted to take his crew through the Arctic Circle, which hadn't been done before. And there's just a whole story about what they had to go through and the challenges they had to face and how he managed those challenges and how he dealt with them. It's by no means a Stoic book. I don't even think that he doesn't mention Stoicism as far as I know. He didn't read Stoicism, but the book itself has a lot of Stoic kind of ideals in it, and you get to read that in real time. You kind of see them applied, so to speak. And then the other one is one that we bring up a lot on the podcast and on our spaces and stuff, but is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. So Viktor Frankl was in the concentration camps during World War II, and he was a doctor there. So just what he saw from his patients, he has a psychology background. He's a psychotherapist, but he obviously was one of the few people who had the medical training to care for the people in these concentration camps. So he was given that responsibility and ended up writing a book about what he saw, which was extremely eye-opening and very much, you know, showcases some of these kind of Stoic ideals and things like that. But is there any book like that with you, Benny, that kind of jumps out as maybe not being strictly Stoic, but representing the ideals of Stoicism?
Yeah, and I you know, maybe some honorable mentions there as well, like Cicero's speeches and all these things are great to read as well. It's not necessarily Stoic; he adhered more to like the academics, but I think the academics, or like at least the skeptics, maybe at that time it was more like towards the skeptics. But and for me, one of the ones I really liked reading was Michel de Montaigne, 16th century philosopher. That I really enjoyed. One of his great essays, for example, is called, you know, "To Philosophize is to Learn How to Die." And one of the interesting quotes that I know from him is like, you know, even on the highest throne, they sit on their asses, right? So it's like even they are people. And he approached philosophy. He's like, I'm not an expert in philosophy, but I am an expert in myself. So he used himself as the main subject of examination. So that was one that I really liked. And the interesting thing, like you mentioned, you know, that book as well, like the endurance, right? It's not necessarily about Stoicism, but when I was reading Dune, you know, the Dune books, the science fiction books by Frank Herbert, a lot of the, you know, different philosophies, but a lot of Stoicism comes into those as well. Like you can see them in other different books. You can as well. Obviously, once your mind is triggered to Stoicism, you'll see it everywhere. But that's something that I liked and that I picked up on. And because I like those books and because I can see the philosophy coming back in there, and even if they don't mention it necessarily, it's still kind of, you could see that at the litany of fear, you know, that's such a Stoic, for me at least, a Stoic kind of way of looking at it, right? And if I can't remember, you know, by the top of my head, but you can Google that, you know, the litany of fear in June. I think that's one of those really great big mantras that tell you so. So for me, those are the kind of those kind of books. Also, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. You know, that Mind 1 and Mind 2, where you give yourself that pause to really analyze things that are going on, right? So yeah, there's so many great books, and I also think it is good to mix it up with different philosophies, right? To read other kind of styles and really question yourself, like, You can pick up some Plato or some Socrates or some Aristotle. I mean, like, these are not the easiest kind of books to read through, but if you like that, you can go for those as well. But I think that those are the kind of I was surprised to see Stoic philosophy come back in like science fiction and these novels, and that's what I like as well, to kind of pick up on it on those moments.
Yeah, it definitely shows up, and I agree. Like once you kind of understand the concepts and once you have your mind turned on to Stoicism, you do start to see it everywhere. But yeah, maybe the next time we meet and have this sort of discussion, we'll talk about movies and TV shows that kind of display these things, because I think that's another one that you can kind of watch things and see how certain characters just interact in situations, and you can learn that way, just like you would from learning from a historical figure or anything like that.
Yeah, and one that I read just recently is, and I didn't read it before, The Practical Stoic by Ward Farnsworth. I really like that one as well. Very surprising, and then obviously when you read like I think the ones. There's a like a degree of like how academic these books get, right? So we mentioned Donald Robertson and then Massimo Pigliucci and William Irvine. I think that's kind of more of like the beginner books. I think Ryan Holiday's even is like the real beginner book. That's kind of like that's where you start. Then you have that next level, and then the next one you have like The Inner Citadel by Pierre Hadot. That's a little bit more to the academic side, at least for me, and then you have like the Stoic Guide, the Cambridge Guide to the Stoics. That was well above my pay grade. I read some of the essays. I was like, okay, that's just not for me. But I think that's the wonderful thing, and the how like the Stoic content is growing. That there is something out there for everyone, right? So if you are listening to this and you feel like I want to get started, there is a book out there. And just for example, reading Meditations. It can give you so much, not just like when you say, I want to learn about Stoic philosophy, but also just about how a man lives, right? And what kind of struggles they go through. So, yeah, I think that's the wonderful thing about the Stoic content that is out there now, from the ancients to the contemporary works, is that there's something for anyone, everybody out there. Yeah. And go online and you'll find even more. Go on viastoica.com. We have a blog, so you can read about all of this stuff some more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I mentioned earlier in this conversation, when I brought up Stoicism to my therapist, he had actually said, because it was like a month or something before, it was his birthday, and his friend had given him a book called Stoicism for Drummers. Like, he's a drummer in a band as a hobby. It's just what he does for fun. He plays drums, and it was Stoicism for Drummers. And I don't even know what the book entails. I don't know what's in it, but it's just, he's like, oh yeah, Stoicism, I think I've heard about that. Yeah, a friend gave me a book about it. And I'm just like, so yeah, they really can be applied to anything that you're doing, whether that's your what you do for a living, or what you do for a hobby, or what you do in your own life. Because at the end of the day, Stoicism is a philosophy for living. It's a philosophy for life. So these teachings and these concepts are going to apply to what we naturally do every day. So I do think that, again, it's the more you can learn about yourself, and is always best. And I think the fastest way to learn is through reading books, because you can condense down a lifetime of learning from the author into a 3, 4, 5 hour, read, depending on the length of the book, but, which I think is a good ROI. So, get out there. And I was not a reader for maybe the first 25 years of my life, but that's changed drastically in the last 10. So, and I'm grateful for it. So, enjoyed the conversation today, though. This is good.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. And even more, Stoic books in Dutch, just to kind of end it from my part, we had because I'm from the Netherlands, but I read more in English. I find it very weird to read in Dutch, to be honest. Well, not really, but like books. But I did read, and the book is in English right now. We had him on the podcast a few episodes as well. Mark Duitert, who was a Dutch speed skater. He won the Olympic gold medal. And for me, that was such a great book to see how an athlete, a professional athlete, uses a philosophy like that to grow in his career, right? And he gives very practical guidelines to use it. He gives like the time that's called the Stoic mindset, or if you want to read it in Dutch, it's called Drive. He has got another book, Flow, but the Stoic mindset really shows that there. So for me, that's why it's so nice that so many more people are getting into Stoicism and writing about it from their own experiences. So that is definitely one book that I would also put up there to recommend people to read. The Stoic Mindset by Mark Titer. We'll put the link in the descriptions, because the last name is going to be a little bit difficult to find. But that's just one last honorable mention I wanted to put out there before we close it. But no, I love that, and it's great to hear more about your reading journey here, and about how you went through it, and also what really inspired you, and that what you got out of it. So no, awesome conversation, Brendan.
Yeah, it was a good time, Benny. Thanks for sitting down and having this little chat with me. Definitely got my list of books now that I'm gonna go read, at least the ones that I hadn't yet, and maybe even reread some, because there's a lot of joy in rereading books as well.
I agree. Yeah, thanks, and we'll speak next. Thank you for listening to the Via Stoica Podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review. Your feedback will help us reach more like-minded people on the journey to self-improvement. If you want to get in touch with us or find more information, you can go to viastoica.com, your one-stop platform for all things Stoicism and living better. And remember, virtue is the only good.